You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Doing great, man. And we might get some background noise because we've decided to record on Wednesday this week. The landscapers are here, and they are mowing. And I've heard them a few times, but we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Sounds okay to me, but we'll see what it looks like in the post-production world. And of course, you've got landscapers. I actually have a guy in my yard with a chainsaw cutting down dead trees. So hopefully that won't impact us too much. But those are first world problems as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah. And actually, for our banter this week, I wanted to bring up a non-first world problem. So I've been listening to, of course, the Risky Business podcast. I listen to it pretty much every week. And this week they were talking about kind of Microsoft's moves relative to the war in Ukraine, which is that they've taken the stance that they are not going to issue patches to their software for Russia. And, you know, the debate goes something like they think it's a really bad idea for a couple of reasons. One is because there are a lot of, non-combatant organizations in Russia that depend on their operating system. For example, hospitals or orphanages or whatever. And so if hackers are able to break into those systems, they can cause a lot of problems. And, nobody wants to see hospitals and orphanages or even just, innocent bystanders get hurt by this. And then issue number two is that they send the signal out to the rest of the world that, hey, if your country ends up on the blacklist, we're not going to patch your software. And that's going to make companies think twice about using their software. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like we talked about this a while back. I just don't know how effective this sort of approach is because how do they even block it? Like, okay, if you're have a Russian IP address, you just can't get patches. Okay, well, I'll just go to a VPN and change my I can watch Netflix anywhere I want in the world. Like, how's that going to actually work? I think you're totally right. It's not a smart munition. I think it's a shotgun approach, and you're hurting just as many people as you might be helping. I get the intention behind it. I just don't know how effective it is. But I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the efficacy of patching and things like that. I'm skeptical of how effective it is. But I did see, I think Ukraine awarded Microsoft some sort of freedom medal or something like that. So
yeah,
I support the intention. I just don't know how effective it actually is in the real world.
Yeah, it kind of feels like it's not incredibly well thought out. I think that, like you said, the intention is right, but I kind of fall on the side of where the risky business guys are, relative to the potential downside, the potential fallout of such a move. It's just the squeeze won't be worth the juice.
Yeah, it's always that balance, right? Is the benefit worth it or not? I mean, I'm not going to claim to know everything, so I'm guessing Microsoft thinks that it is for some reason, and maybe it's not even a technical reason. It could just be a PR reason. I hate to be negative down that route, but it could just be, hey, we're throwing our support behind it in the way that they think is the best way to do it. I don't know. Not my jam, not my pig, not my farm. How about that?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So what have you been up to this week?
Moving, so still getting set up. Finally have my office sort of set up, so I'm no longer in a makeshift couch. Got one of these fancy standing desks, so we're trying this one standing up, which is kind of cool and interesting. But things are going well. No bear sightings this week, not since the last one, our first couple days here. So far so good. And like I said, I got a guy with a chainsaw outside cutting down trees.
Yeah, so this episode is going live on July 11th, at which point I will be unemployed.
Mm-hmm.
It will be in between positions. So I'm
a drain on the economy.
A drain on the economy. Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I will be leaving my current post and coming to work again with you. Isn't that going to get the party back together?
very exciting. I'm sure we'll be talking about it more in the future, but yes, the relationship continues as it's been successful for the last almost decade at this point. And yeah, exciting things in store. So super happy, super excited that things are working out the way they are so far. I don't want to jinx anything, but yes, we'll have some uh, some new things coming up, and the band is definitely sticking together. And I think we'll have some more opportunities to do some cool stuff, including potentially recording at Gartner in a few weeks. So if you're going to be at Gartner, ping Jim or I. The plan is for us to both be there. And I think we're going to try to figure out maybe how to do some recordings on site, maybe get some guests, get some comments, feedback from maybe attendees, things like that. Haven't quite figured out all the logistics on it yet, but that is certainly the intention. So that'll be cool and exciting because you and I were talking before we hit record here. I can't remember the last time I saw you. I think it's been close. It's been at least 3 years, I think, maybe at this point, other than you being a window on the screen.
I was going to say, how do you know it's really me? How do you know it's not a deep fake of me? Somebody's taken over my identity and is projecting out as me. The only reason I think it's pretty clear it is me is that, who would come up with this kind of content other than me?
Your mind works in mysterious ways, that is for sure. But yeah, I don't know for fact, but this is actually should we just get into that article? Because I think you sent this to me, and I'm glad that when you think of deepfakes, you think of me. I don't know if I should be, honored or impressed or what about it, but there was an article, I think it was from Dark Reading, that talked through basically criminals using deepfake videos to interview for remote work. And this is something that you and I talked about maybe a year, at least more ago at this point, where it was just first coming out and kind of becoming easier for people to use. And I'm curious, when you read this article, what were your thoughts around it?
Well, my initial thought was, oh, Jeff is going to love this. But
correct thought, yes.
Yeah, so correct thought. I guess my initial thought was, I look, if you're going to kind of be cutting edge to use technology like deepfake, why would you use it to get a job? It seems to me like getting a job is probably not that hard, but I think that where using the deepfake would make the most sense is trying to beat verified credential systems. So, in other words, trying to deepfake and show a passport and get access to somebody's identity online to launch some kind of hack. I guess my initial impact was I didn't see this as the use case you'd want to really use the deepfake for.
Yeah, no, I'm more about the memes and trying to get our guy Fletcher into various compromising situations of not the real variety. But this is actually pretty close to what I was thinking is sort of like a threat. Is definitely the identity verification component. Especially, so there's a couple things here, right? So deepfakes, an impressive technology. We've seen it in movies. We've seen it in, I'm sure people scrolling through Instagram and TikTok and all their stuff. But the technology is at a point now where it is relatively easy to use, that now it becomes to start to be a problem for identity verification, especially in a remote workforce environment where I am looking at you on a screen right now in our conferencing, podcasting sort of environment here. I am assuming it's you. I'm pretty confident that it is. Am I 100%? No, 99%. But as these technologies become more prevalent, if you're sitting in an interview, for example, and I know that this has been a challenge for certain areas of the world where, the one person shows up for an interview and is not the person that applied for the role. And sometimes it could be for, a relatively benign reason. It could be the person is very skilled technically, but just has a hard time interviewing for whatever reason. And they hire somebody to basically be their public face. But the real work is getting done behind the scenes, who someone maybe isn't good on the interviewing side. I think we've probably all, heard stories that are kind of similar to that. Now you've got a situation where criminals might be leveraging it for any number of reasons. The lazy person to me says, okay, well, great, I'm going to get hired and, get a job in a company, and who knows, they might give me access to something. They might pay me for 2, 3, 4 weeks and never actually do any real work. And in the meantime, I wasn't ever kind of a real person anyway, so it may be tough to track down. So I think there's a variety of different options. None of them are good, unfortunately, in this case. But I hate to throw out the technology because I do see the benefit for entertainment. Even as a accessibility tool, maybe for some people who require those sorts of technologies. But it is certainly something to be aware of. I think this is a question also that we asked. I think I remember asking Mike Engel this of One Cosmos a while back. Is how, from this identity verification on a remote standpoint and things like liveness checks, how do you know that's not a deep fake? And I think he had. I don't remember his exact answer. I think they felt it was they had a pretty good solution in place. For that. I know Adobe, for example, has spent time and money on kind of developing tools to kind of help detect that. But when you're doing remote conversations like this, you may not have the visual fidelity that you can rely on to really kind of inspect pixel by pixel to see if shadows are cast in the right way or whatever it may be. I think it's very interesting. It's obviously something that I find personally interesting as well, and I think of the bad things that can happen with it. But I hope to think that there will be some good use cases out of it too. Like I said, I gotta get the memes going for my guy Fletcher.
I think that the thinking back to the Mike Engel conversation, my takeaway was we just try and stay one step ahead of the bad guys, right? I mean, that's probably all you can do. I think if you take a historical perspective, 120 years ago, they invented the electric light bulb. Thomas Edison invented the electric light bulb. That's 120 years ago, a little more than a lifetime ago. Now look at things. We're even having this deep fake conversation. So what can happen 20, 40, 50 years down the road? It's just like, I don't think we can even predict.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe we'll become deep fake individuals ourselves, and then instead of streaming our stupid faces, maybe we just go to a fully cartoon format.
Yeah.
And that becomes a persona. What's the band? Gorillaz, I think, was kind of revolutionary in that spot where it's a real band, but their public persona was basically cartoon monkeys or gorillas, and that was sort of like how they portrayed themselves to the world until they kind of came out later on and showed their real faces. But I thought that was interesting.
That nobody cared about them.
I like some of their songs. The other thing I think too is like what happens if someone does a deep fake of a CEO and then calls into somebody and says, "Hey, do this," and it's convincing enough where somebody does it. Right? We've heard stories of people calling in and doing voice deep fakes and voicemails and things like that where things have gone awry. But I think now as we get to more of a distributed and remote workforce, you may not ever actually see the person that you've been emailing. And what happens if you get socially engineered and all of a sudden, a deep fake person comes on, tells you to do something and you trust it? I think it opens up a lot of avenues. You got to be careful from that social engineering aspect because, as you and I know, social engineering continues to be the scourge of data breach guardians all over the place.
Yeah, that's a great point, though. Just one more thought on the deepfake is that it makes identity and access management, verifying credentials, all that much more important. That, all right, now I have the CEO in front of me telling me to do something. Can I be sure that it's him? And it's not just that it looks like him, sounds like him, just like I got an email, looks like something he would have written. It's got the letterhead, must be from the CEO. It goes back to that. The next thing that we're leading into is just social engineering, and it's still one of the main ways that credentials are being stolen.
Yep. I think you want to talk about our data breach of the week.
Yeah, sure. So it's Marriott, and I think we'll have a link to an article in the show notes if anybody wants to read up on it. But it was, I think, within the past week where an employee at the Baltimore Airport Marriott Hotel was social engineered into giving away their credentials. Now, the article is not clear on whether or not the employee had the data on their device. I'm assuming not. I'm assuming that they were connected back into the network and that the hacker was able to leverage some kind of pathway through that endpoint device back into the network. But it sounds like they got 20 gigabytes worth of PII data. Now, I think Marriott's saying that, hey, it wasn't that, all that was reported by, I think the hackers leaked out that, hey, we got all this credit card information and things like that. Um, but according to the article, Marriott's like denying that it was, that level of data, but it's kind of concerning because I think they've kind of run into this scenario several times where it's like the social engineering. I think, my biggest takeaway, or, it's not even just a takeaway, it's just kind of um, uh, uh, you know, confirming in my mind what is often the case, which is that a lot of folks in the IT space think that, okay, you can't get through. If we're doing MFA and we're doing one credential per person, you log in and it's just employees and we have good deprovisioning processes. We feel good that the person has gone through the right checks. However, I think with social engineering, we had Roger Grimes on, even with MFA, you can be social engineered out of a multi-factor credential. Now, once you get into the network, are your network conditions designed in such a way, like a zero trust kind of way, that you're going to be limited in terms of your movement, in terms of what you can access. You can't change credentials now that you're through the door, and that you're not depending on the fact that, okay, people who are on this side of the firewall we trust, people on that side of the firewall we don't trust. I think that's the at the most basic level what zero trust is all about targeting, which is that traditional mentality that we have a firewall, and inside of the firewall it's a higher level of trust. Zero trust says it doesn't matter inside or outside the firewall, the trust level is zero. We don't trust you because you're on the inside. You need to be able to present the credentials for the system. Now, the reason I bring all that up is that a front desk worker at one of the property locations, their credentials should not be able to get 20 gigabytes of data. So I'm assuming that unless the system that had that data was extremely flawed, that they elevated to another credential. That's also cause for concern. But I mean, we don't know all that. We're just, there's obviously like an article that's, a couple of paragraphs long. It doesn't give all the anatomy of the breach, but that's what we kind of know at this point.
Yeah, it's a little light on details, but at the end of the day, social engineering strikes again. The unhappy path, right? I think of maybe people looking for access to things. It sounds like, even if they had MFA, it wouldn't have mattered in this case. Someone got tricked into doing it, and I think this is where the education component comes in. I think we still see reports, at least that I've seen, that still show that awareness and security education is still dollar for dollar the best spend, especially for scenarios like this. The challenge is, how do you make sure that you're targeting the right people? It's easy enough to say, okay, yeah, we'll never fall for phishing, and then the one time that you fall for it is the bad time. So you can continually have to reinforce. And Roger's quoted on this in this article from SiliconANGLE, and we'll definitely have the link in the show note. But he points out a good thing here is it's the continual reinforcement of that message. Always be alert for it. You start to develop sort of that mindset and that awareness. But yeah, as a Marriott Bonvoy person, I find it disappointing again. I think I saw an article elsewhere that this is the 7th time that they've had a data incident since like 2010. So, if you're averaging one every other year, that's probably not a great stat that you probably want to be proud of. Hopefully things get better, but I would assume they're a pretty big target, right? I think one of their last hacks also had was linked back to China and some espionage going on there as well. So all the more reason to try and close as many doors as you can, and certainly start to look at potentially zero trust, but also behavior analytics, right? 20 gigs of data, exiting your network should trip all kinds of alarms. Accessing that number, that much data should also trip up some things as well to try and be more proactive about it.
That's absolutely right. Those are all great points. I think in their defenses, they've got a global customer base. Um, They are the biggest hotel chain in the world. I love Marriott. I mean, I went to book um, a hotel for an upcoming trip, and it was in San Francisco. And like the number of boutique hotels that came back that are now under the Marriott umbrella is really impressive. Um, but I think with having a global customer base, um, you've got so many different challenges in terms of the requirements for data privacy and really what level of multi-factor authentication is feasible. I mean, the use case is that you pretty much anybody in the world could become a member. They may have a smartphone, they may not have a smartphone.
You want them to become a member. I mean, that's your whole business, right? You want everyone to be a customer, at least. I think now we're thinking like B2C in that scenario for MFA. Um, how does MFA work differently between B2C, B2B, B2E? This is actually a conversation that I started earlier today with my new friend Nick. We were kind of talking about, what's the difference between customer MFA versus what I'll call workforce MFA, and I'll lump B2B within that workforce environment as well, because typically they might be an extension of your workforce or maybe like a supplier or something like that. But it was an interesting conversation because I think at face value, it's like, oh, it's just MFA. But as you and I know, and anybody probably that's neck deep in authentication, they are very different beasts and very different use cases and very different user experiences that come into it. And I guess maybe this is where we'll kind of take the main conversation for today is what is the difference between customer MFA versus workforce MFA? From your perspective, which do you think is harder to do?
I think one of the hardest things to do with MFA is to get the user experience right. And I kind of feel like the user experience on the customer side um, is a little bit more difficult. You've got to get it more tailored. And what it ends up doing is requiring you to scale back having a complex process. So you compromise strength for usability. On the employee side, I think it tends, or the workforce side, I should say, it tends to be less that way. So, for example, um, and I think this conversation has so many tentacles, but from a technology perspective, most MFA technology that works for the workforce will also work for the customer. So, one example is SMS text for a one time password, a time based one time password, and you get it sent to your phone. And you see that in so many different customer scenarios because they have the person's phone number on file, and sending them a text is pretty much universal. It'll work whether you have a flip phone or you have a smartphone. However, I think on the employee side, having worked with so many customers, I rarely see anybody dependent on SMS, time based one time password. Um, when you do see it, it's usually as an option B or an option C. And I will point out that hacking that kind of scenario is usually based on the unhappy path. So it's, oh, my authenticator application is not working. Okay, then we'll just send you an SMS. Oh, I don't have that. I just changed my phone number. Okay, well, just log in with these secret questions. I was like, okay, yeah, I've got the secret questions because they got dumped with this big data breach that happened somewhere. But yeah, that's that. So, what's harder to do? I don't know that one's necessarily harder than the other, except that I think that if you're saying which one's harder to do in a very secure way, I think customers harder to do in a very secure way.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, just the sheer footprint, right? The number of customers you might have, the variety of devices that might be out there. And I think that's why we see SMS continue to be leveraged, even though it's not even recommended at this point to keep using. It's still better than nothing. So you see that as sort of like the fallback plan. Sometimes the only, the primary for some organizations. I guess I see them as equally difficult, but for different reasons. The customer side, definitely the user experience, but I feel like for the customer side, you can narrow down the paths pretty pretty specifically, we're going to do SMS, we're going to do email magic link, we're going to do only push notification through our own branded app that you need to download from the store, right? Something like that. Um, and I feel like still traditionally, organizations are willing to spend the money on customers, on security, on usability, on the user experience versus the workforce, where sometimes they'll put up with a less than great experience because, well, it's just our workforce. We don't really care, about their experience, which I don't think is correct way to approach it. And I think on the workforce side, you get into really interesting and very specific use cases where how do you deliver MFA to a variety of personas on the workforce side? Sure, there's going to be your, we'll call them kind of your typical office worker who might have a smartphone and can use it. But what happens if you are working with somebody who works in like a clean room environment or a shop floor or someplace where they can't bring a physical device in with them? How are you going to deliver to them a multi-factor, device? They can't carry a phone, can't carry a token. Is there a phone call that they get maybe, and they have to do voice verification? Is it a retina scan, a fingerprint? I think you get into some really interesting use cases on the workforce side that you really don't need to account for as often on the customer side. And so I think it depends, which is a great consulting answer. Which one's harder? But I feel like workforce can be harder depending on how complex your authentication scenarios look like. Do you need to account for some things like that? If you have a pretty basic workforce, it's just, hey, we're all logging into Microsoft and we want to turn on, MFA through Microsoft. That's probably pretty easy. It's always the details and those like edge use cases that trip up a lot of organizations, and then they start developing, not necessarily backdoors, but maybe backdoors, but alternative exception paths that might be easier to exploit than just having a standard process that all of our users go through. All of our customers do this. Maybe not all your employees do it.
I think if you were to paint with a broad brush too, generally speaking, the customer side scale is way greater than the workforce side scale, right? I mean, there are certainly companies with enormous workforces, and there are certainly companies where their customer footprint is relatively small. But let's assume customers in the millions, workforce in the thousands. It makes it very difficult to use some of the stronger technologies for MFA, like authenticator applications. One of the scenarios where I've run into personally a few times is where you change devices. So even if you're going from one iPhone to the next generation iPhone, you back up the iPhone, restore the new iPhone. It doesn't bring over the authenticator app information. You have to re-register the device. And if you do that before, you do that and you get rid of the old phone, or you already wiped the old phone, you go to access the application. It's like, oh, so now what do I do? Okay, maybe they have a backup path, but if there isn't a backup path, what do you do? I think from a customer IAM perspective, you'd have to think through that whole scenario. And do you want to put your customers through the headache of having to call a help desk? Well, if it's a banking scenario, it always comes down to the risk, what your answer is going to be. And probably you have to ask yourself the question is like, is my customer going to go through this? Or are they going to abandon doing business with me? And so if your level of affiliation is not so strong, I think at the most at that point you can do is like an SMS or an email. So the challenge is you might not be implementing the level of security that you want to implement, because we already know there's a lot of weaknesses and a lot of ways around SMS and email, especially if you're dealing with people who would be like a target, like, politicians or human rights activists or celebrities, things like that. I mean, they use their customers of different places as well, right? And people love to get their accounts. Um, Thinking on the employee side, I think putting those strong controls in is very reasonable. And not even to say like we don't care about the user experience, but if you get to the end and you go get a new device and you have to call the help desk because you didn't do things in the order you should have done them, or for whatever reason, you're still talking thousands instead of millions. And it's more feasible, and plus you're paying those individuals. So there's some level of expectation that, hey, there's something that comes along with that.
Yeah, I I think about it from blast radius too. If a customer account gets breached, what can they actually do with the customer information? One person's probably not going to have a good time, or maybe a family, right, that might be associated with that. If a employee account were to get breached, I think the blast radius tends to be larger in that case, and the damage might be more significant, relatively speaking. Now, if it's the wrong person on the customer side, that could have catastrophic, issues as well. But where is the most damage going to get done? Is it because one customer didn't set up MFA in their account, or that one customer got breached, or because one employee got breached? I see the latter because we're seeing it on customer accounts or employee accounts getting breached, and then getting access to other sorts of data within the environment. I know Okta had struggled with it early this year with one of their MSPs. Had they got Okta itself didn't get breached, but the MSP did.
Yeah, that's that
So
B2B
the blast
scenario.
radius to me plays a lot into this to say, okay, well, what's if the goal is to provide security, it's obviously important to make sure that the customer data is safe. But if a customer gets breached, it's one customer. If the employee gets breached, it could be multiple customers, as we saw here, potentially with whatever happened with Marriott. Um, that's why I think I lean towards they're probably the same from a difficulty standpoint, but for different reasons, based on the different types of complexity. If it's a couple hundred people on the enterprise side, maybe in the workforce, maybe it is less of a concern, or maybe the type of business that you do just isn't as much of a target. Maybe you're more of a ransomware target just for, getting a few bucks out of you versus maybe something that's more targeted, espionage, or, in the case of war, trying to bring down, different services or whatever it may be. I think that blast radius has to play into the decision as well. Do you want to lose customers? No. Do you want your company to go underground and lose everything because the proper security wasn't in place? I think that's equally as important, and maybe even more important in some scenarios.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're in a scenario where what's the difference between the two? I think technically speaking, the technologies work the same, or the same sets of technologies can be used
Mm-hmm.
for either scenario, but
An
some are more
SMS is an SMS is an SMS, or a magic
SMS.
link is the same, or a push notification. They're all the same. They work the same.
Right. And you know what? I mean, sometimes I really like the SMS. If it's something that, my LinkedIn account, for example, I need to access it. Um, do I think that SMS is the strongest form of MFA? Absolutely not. But I think that using SMS as MFA is appropriate for the level of risk involved with logging into LinkedIn. And
Sounds to
what
me
I,
like you're inviting people to try and man in the middle of you and take over the Jimmy Mac IAM LinkedIn profile.
oh
Maybe
yeah,
this is where deepfakes get started.
all of our millions of listeners who are out there like, oh yeah, you're going to challenge me.
Yeah, well, you only need a small percentage angry at you, and then bad things happen.
That's true. That's true. But one thing I feel like I need to bring this up, but it's so cool, like how on iOS devices now, when you get an SMS one-time password, whether you're in a native app or in a browser-based application, if you have the focus on the where you enter your SMS code, it kind of pops up and you just push the button and you're right in. I mean, that's a great time saver.
Yeah, I'm happy Google and Apple have figured that part out. I'll be much happier when the FIDO standards get put in place and we start to see passkeys just live there, and it just becomes, look at your phone to authenticate, or press the fingerprint button, or whatever it may be. Even that'll become a whole lot easier. But yeah, so it's those little time savers that make the difference, I think, on the usability side.
That's right.
Nobody likes having to put in a second password, because that's really what we're talking about. Is SMS is just another password. So the easier that you can get it into the right field and make it secure, the better. I'm sure there are people figuring out, how to scrape that information from the message app on your phone and do man in the middle. I think especially on Google or Android, there's tons of messaging apps. It's not the same messaging app for everybody, and some of those you give permissions that they can see your clipboard, they can see everything you type. How secure is that? I don't know. You're putting a lot of trust into whatever messaging app you're using to not read every single thing you're typing into it, and store it somewhere or be able
That's
to
right.
capture it and send it elsewhere. So I think there's good and bad that comes along with it. I like the idea of it. I have a little more trust in Apple's implementation of it, but yeah, it's everything has a risk and a reward to it.
Well, what you brought up there with the FIDO um, possibility, I wonder how that would work when switching an iOS device, because are those keys going to transfer when you get the new one, or you're going to have to re-register your device? I'm assuming it's
I
you
imagine
come up.
iCloud's going to be a big part of this because that's how iCloud the keychain works right now between Mac OS, iOS, and iPad OS. The iCloud portion is really syncing things behind the scenes. And even if you use something like the Microsoft Authenticator on iOS, you can still back up your Microsoft Authenticator keys to your iCloud account. You go to your new device, log in with your Microsoft account, and then restore from iCloud your keys. So I think the
Is that
cloud will
true?
certainly.
Are you sure of that?
Don't quote
Or
me on it,
in
but I'm pretty
theory?
sure because I
Because
change devices all the time, and I rarely have to register new apps within my authenticator. So I don't use Microsoft for everything. I use Authy for some things as well. So somewhere there is a sync and a decryption that's taking place that takes all of my one-time password generators through my authenticator app and is putting them on my new device. I'm not going out and re-registering like 50 new apps every time I get a new phone. Otherwise, I would stop getting new phones, and I don't want to do that.
no, but I recently got a new phone with my previous employer, and they're a Microsoft shop, and they install Intune to create like basically
Yeah,
it installs
the
a
MDM on
their
Intune definitely throws a wrench into it sometimes.
yeah. Yeah, somehow it's creating some kind of encrypted package using the keys on your phone. So if you have that, I think it makes it much more difficult to kind of take your registration from before and use it. It's almost like you have to just start over.
Yeah, that's why I think the workforce side could be more tricky. If I'm a consumer, you generally don't see that problem as often because they're allowing you to move those one-time password generators between devices. If you have something like an Intune or an other MDM platform, there's probably more controls around it by policy that is blocking you from doing that. You need to put a new certificate on, which invalidates maybe the previous tokens that were used, and you have to set it up again. That is definitely something that I have seen and experienced. It's painful when it happens
Yeah.
because it always happens at the worst time. But I can see that scenario, and maybe this tips it for some people. Say, yeah, workforce might be harder because of that type of scenario. Whereas on the consumer side, you maybe don't have that level of control over the device. So therefore, you have to be a little bit more open with it, and just by that nature, it makes it maybe a little bit easier to deploy.
Yeah. Well, the other thought that crossed my mind as you were talking about, different scenarios with workforce being more difficult is I think you're going in posture of all of your security tools, how close you are to kind of a zero trust world. Because if somebody does kind of slip through the cracks of MFA, are they now in, they can just run wild, or have you established kind of the entry into the network that's going to segment and limit their access around the network? So I think there's that element kind of plays into how much risk you're talking about.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, how many times do we, people who are listening, right? When they log onto their company VPN, can you get anywhere on the network, or basically in any rule from a routing perspective, or are you limited? Right. That's one of the first steps from a zero trust perspective is making sure that you can only get to the resources you can. And you and
That
I,
you
we
need
still
to,
see
right?
lots of companies that have VPNs that are wide open. Hey, once you're on VPN, you're trusted. You can go anywhere, do anything you want. I think
It's
maybe not
almost
necessarily the way you
shocking
want to do
that
it.
that's still so much the case. I mean, I work with so many organizations, and that's exactly where they are. If you get on the VPN, you have full access, and
It's hard. it's hard to do. I mean, you're basically talking about re-architecting your IP space within an organization. If you're small enough, maybe it's not as difficult. But if you're a relatively large organization, or you have a pretty complex environment, maybe you have to do segregation between, I don't know, like, manufacturing lines and SCADA devices, or power company or bank or whatever it may be, and you haven't like figured that out or architected it in advance. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, but it's
I mean, you should be
worthwhile
doing
work,
it.
right? I mean,
Right.
think about it like, all right, so I was on the network engineering side early in my IT career, and each office had IP segments, like this IP range for this office and that IP range for that office. And really, at the most, be able to access kind of the office that you go to, but
Mhm.
really, you shouldn't be accessing any endpoint devices or printing to any printers when you're connecting through VPN. Or if you do, it should be kind of the exception case, or maybe basing it on DNS rather than IP addresses. But you should be accessing applications that are in data centers. And ideally, you get to the point where you're saying you can only access these IP addresses and these ports. Anything beyond that just seems like it's not good enough. And you see, like in other areas of IT where, and information security, where we've made so much progress, but we still, in math, or I say, I don't even know if I'm just overgeneralizing here, but I see it a lot where there's just very little control. Once somebody's on the VPN, they've been authenticated, might have good authentication controls, but once they're in, they're in. They have
Well, I
full
think
run
that's the
of the
difference.
place.
I think that's the difference. I think it is. I think local networks generally are in a better shape, but when it came to VPN, it was just, hey, we need to get access to everybody. And maybe the pandemic accelerated that for people who weren't ready for it, and they had to put something in place, and they didn't have the time to architect the VPN IPs to make sure that they were the way they were supposed to be. So, should they be doing it? Yes. I hope they've started. If they haven't already, they're probably behind the times. But I think that's the difference, right? Is the VPN angle of it is you're coming in any, and if that's what gets breached, and now you have a remote laptop that's been lost or somehow compromised, that's an endpoint that has any access to your network. That's bad times.
Totally agree. Well, Jeff, we could go on all day with different topics, but I do have to kind of wrap here.
Yep. Let's go ahead and wrap it up here. Before we go, today is the 11th. It's National State Fair Food Day. What's your poison?
I'm gonna let you answer first because I think we're gonna answer the same thing, and I've got a good number of answers I could go with.
I mean, I'll eat most things. I think, the I actually haven't been too exotic when it comes to state fairs. Like, I've never had a deep fried Twinkie or a Snickers bar or anything like that. But I do enjoy. We were talking about this before we started, as the funnel cake. I was like, yeah, that's my jam. That's my wife's jam too. We try to get at least one per year, into us. But that's where I'm going to go with
So with the
funnel
funnel
cake.
cake, do you like a lot of powdered sugar,
I like define a lot, because it
like a
certainly needs to
mountain?
be covered. No, like, yeah, you should not. It should be an appropriate amount of powdered sugar. It should not be a mountain that you can stick your finger through and not hit any funnel cake, if that makes sense.
Well, there's also like sometimes I've seen them where people get the funnel cake, powdered sugar, and then like
Like
chocolate
Nutella
drizzle
maybe, or something on it. Yeah,
or caramel. Yeah.
yeah.
What do you
No,
think of that?
I'm a plain. I like the funnel cake the way it was meant to be, just some powdered sugar. But I, certainly am willing to allow others, if they wanted to desecrate their funnel cake with various sauces or dips.
Yeah. So I mean, that's definitely like funnel cake is. If anybody's listening and hasn't had funnel cake, you need to try it. Unless you're diabetic, you need to try it. It's
Yeah,
wonderful. I do like the fried Oreos, and I will get them once in a while. I'm not a junk food connoisseur, but they are pretty good. And the
I've never
fried
had one.
Twinkies and fried Snickers bars.
I don't
We're
know. I
living in
love
the
Snickers.
south of the
Yeah.
U.S. now, so you have to get your carnival on.
Well, this will be yet another excuse for my ever-expanding waistline. So, all right, we'll go ahead and leave it there for this week. Appreciate everyone for listening. One of the things that we like to do is, have conversations like this. If you've got topics that are out there, feel free to hit us up on LinkedIn. If you're going to be a Gartner, hit us up on LinkedIn. We'd love to fist bump, maybe figure out if there's something that we can, get guests on the show and kind of talk through that. I love hearing stories from people who are out in the field. So definitely don't hesitate to ping Jim or I on LinkedIn for that sort of thing. You can catch us online on the web, identityatthecenter.com. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. I'm finally getting my office back in order and getting schedules, back in order. So I'm sure the live stream will come back at some point, but we still have those out there on YouTube at idac.live as a shortcut. So hopefully people will check those out. And with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Appreciate everyone. Jim, thanks for your time. Thank you all for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.